John Donne was fascinated by genre and forms and structure, but really only in the sense that he was able to readdress that genre and form. He takes the Petrarchan form in which courtly love is symbolized in the body and beauty of the beloved and turns it into something refreshingly new and very different. If Petrarch inspired the early sonnet writers of sonnet sequences to become preoccupied with turning mortal, vulgar, earthly love and passion into something divine, partly by making the beloved lady divine herself, then Donne takes up that tension and runs with it and probes it and asks, really, is that possible that mortal love can be so transposed into something divine? Would my naked, scrawny body, warts and all, really take anyone to heaven? Hello. In this video I'll be looking at John Donne's poem Air and Angels. If you haven't had a chance to look at my previous video on the life and biography and history of John Donne, click back, watch it, it's worth it. I give a lot of context, historical framework for understanding John Donne's poetry. Okay, first let's have a quick read through of the poem, published in 1633. Air and Angels. Twice or thrice had I loved thee before I knew thy face or name, so in a voice, so in a shapeless flame. Angels affect us oft and worshipped be, still when to where thou wert I came, some lovely glorious nothing I did see. Since my soul, whose child love is, takes limbs of flesh, and else could nothing do, more subtle than the parent is, love must not be, but take a body too. And therefore, what thou wert and who, I bid love ask, and now, that it assume my body, I allow, and fix itself in thy lip, eye, and brow. Whilst thus to ballast love I thought, and so more steadily to have gone, with wares which would sink admiration, I saw I had love's pinnace overfraught. Every thy hair for love to work upon is much too much, some fitter must be sought. For nor in nothing nor in things extreme and scattering bright can love inhere. Then as an angel face and wings of air, not pure as it, yet pure doth wear, so thy love may be my love's sphere. Just as such disparity as twixt air and angels' purity, twixt women's love and men's will ever be. So, first some questions. How content would you be to have a photo of your loved one rather than their presence? Love is somehow material. We desire a presence, a being to be with us, a body. And yet, isn't love somehow spiritual? Doesn't it seem to go beyond just the rush of heart rate and blood pressure? Well, Donne's poem is comprised of two 14-line verses, two kind of sonnets. And in my first glance at the poem, I think, I wonder if those two verses, two halves of the poem, might represent something, opposing forces perhaps, something divided. Well, as we look closer, the first verse begins as a kind of typical love sonnet in the style of Petrarch, who we'll talk about in a moment. The difference here is that there is no beloved lady upon whom to fix the poet's love and passion. I loved thee before I knew thy face or name, and when I went to look for you, some glorious nothing I did see. That's very different from the typical kind of love poem written in sonnet form in the period. In the 1590s, we saw what many critics have described the first publishing craze or fad, in which most poets that you may have heard of, and many that you haven't, Shakespeare included, wrote love poetry in sonnet form. And I, in my doctoral studies, compiled the first catalogue of all of the sonnet sequences published in that period. And if I were to present to you a list of those sonnet sequences, it would read like a list of women's names quite often. Petrarch himself, who is the archetype for this poetic form, had his Laura. Astrophil, another famous sonnet sequence written by Sir Philip Sidney, Astrophil had his Stella. And there are multiple sonnet sequences compiled to a wordplay on the word ideal, which turns into the woman's name Delia. But with Donne, there is no name. It's as if there's a kind of suggestion of Donne's poetic love being a kind of force emanating from him, seeking a body, seeking a being, a beloved woman upon which to fix itself. And so Donne tells us, just as his soul needs to take a body in order to flourish, love also needs to take a body. It cannot exist without fixing itself upon a physical form of some kind. He says, love must not be, but take a body too. It simply can't exist in isolation. It's always seeking for something upon which to fix itself in order to exist. So at the end of the first verse, we have the lines, I bid love ask, and now, that it assume thy body, and I allow, and fix itself in thy lip, eye, and brow. And so the woman that he is addressing in the poem becomes that focal point or locus of passion, desire, but principally love. So everything seems grand, except we're only halfway through the poem. In the second verse, we begin with a boating or shipping metaphor. Now, if you've seen my previous video on the biography of John Donne, you'll know that he went on some sea adventures. He knows what it's like to be in a ship, to be buoyed by the sea, tossed by the waves, to be seasick, and the dangers and adventures that that kind of life have in store. And so the metaphor comes quite readily to him. He talks about now love being a kind of ballast. Now it's found its fixation in the material world, in the body of the beloved lady. It's a kind of ballast that makes it possible for his ship to sail right. But there's a problem. It comes in the fourth line of the second verse. I saw I had love's pinnace overfraught. There's a wordplay here. It's a vulgar one. The word pinnace does refer in Elizabethan and Jacobean times to a small boat, but it also sounds very similar to a penis. The word overfraught refers to being overcome or overwhelmed. And so his pinnace, his small boat, with love, which has now been fixed upon the body of his beloved lady as its ballast, is overwhelmed. Or we might say in vulgar terms, his penis is overwhelmed. So now we have the problem that love, when fixed upon a material being, a person, does not prove itself to be suitable for steering your ship through life. And so another realm is sought in which love will be able to finally flourish. He says, for nor in nothing, nor in things, extreme and scattering bright, can love inhere. So love can't exist in nothing. It must be fixated upon something. And yet he finds that things that are extreme, scattering bright, or incredibly beautiful and attractive, love cannot exist in either of these states in a permanently happy state. And so the metaphor that now comes to him is one of angels. Now, in this period, angels were composed of a purer or more rarefied air. And so he says, then as an angel of air, not pure as it, yet pure doth wear. So the air is not quite as pure as the rarefied spirit of an angel, and yet the angel can exist within the sphere of that air and perform its function. And so at the end of the second verse, the end of the poem, he compares the disparity there is between air and angels, wherein air is not as fine or as pure as an angel, but an angel can exist in that air. So too can his love exist within the sphere of a woman's love. Though different, though there's a disparity, it can exist. And so this is the metaphor that comes to mind in the poem Air and Angels. Now, we need to talk about Petrarch. On the 6th of April 1327, Petrarch says he encountered a woman at the church at Avignon. Her name was Laura. Petrarch wrote a series of love poems to Laura, who was married and thus unobtainable. And so in his poems, the sonnets of Petrarch, known as Il Canzoni or Rime sparse in English, the painful aspect of an unobtainable love is explored. These sonnets became hugely popular later when they were translated into English. People would carry a small copy around with them quite often, and it gave rise to the enormous craze of publishing sequences of sonnets, often dedicated to an unobtainable, beautiful woman. Dozens of English poets wrote sonnet sequences in a similar fashion, with a similar feeling, exploring similar things. Petrarch inspired a whole generation of poets in this vein. But Donne takes this theme and shows how it doesn't exactly work. You see, Petrarch's only option, and all of the English poets that followed his tradition, of transposing this frustratingly painful, earthly, mortal love into a kind of divine love, a celestial love. Well, Donne takes this and shows how that doesn't work so easily. In Air and Angels, Donne's very small, strange sort of sonnet sequence with two very odd sonnets in them, he doesn't follow exactly the type and the form of the typical sonnet, but they are 14 lines, and it does follow a kind of sonnet pattern. But in his poem Air and Angels, Donne shows how love is like a kind of invisible force seeking a material body around which to coalesce. And he uses the metaphor of the ship needing ballast in order to sail right. But the boat is overwrought, it will sink, and so he thinks of angels being a better focus. But unlike ballast, angels of course are made of spirit, rarefied air, and that's hardly helpful if you need ballast for your ship. And so there's something going wrong with the kind of hierarchy of love, the physics of love that Donne is exploring. It never quite works. Two things cannot completely be reconciled, and mortal, earthly, vulgar, passionate love cannot easily be transposed into divine love. And so the poem resigns itself to the fact that there is a disparity between us and angels, between men and women, between love that's seeking some kind of focus or locus for being, and our attempts to fixate that love upon material and also spiritual things. Now, the failure of Petrarchan style love and love poetry had been noted before. Sonnets mocking and lampooning the style of the Petrarchan crazed, pained lover had been published in the years leading up to the composition of Donne's poem. One sonnet sequence in particular, coming from the 1590s, has the pained lover going to a judge asking for compensation because his heart has been stolen by a woman. It's all done very much tongue-in-cheek to show the excesses of this kind of forlorn, pained lover writing his lyrics to his beloved woman. But Donne doesn't just lampoon and mock the excesses of Petrarchan love poetry. He attempts to dismantle the central theme around which Petrarchan poetry is held together. It's trying to transform earthly, vulgar love into something divine and celestial. And that transformation, or we might call transubstantiation, of profane love into sacred love is something that fascinated Donne. And in his 2 stanzas of Air and Angels, each with 14 lines, the traditional length of a sonnet, Donne shows how that breaks apart. And he shows this in several ways. Firstly, we have the rhyming scheme of each of these sonnets. It doesn't conform to the typical rhyming scheme we would expect. There's a twist there. It's slightly unusual. If you were to read the multiple sonnets from the 1590s, you would become very accustomed to the kinds of rhyming patterns you would expect. Then you read John Donne's Air and Angels, and something's off kilter here. Another aspect is that traditionally love sonnets in the Petrarchan tradition would engage in shifting the lover's male gaze from one aspect of the beloved lady's beauty to another, moving on, building a list of attractive body parts and characteristics which are called a blazon. But Donne's disembodied desire seeks for this shopping list of beautiful, visually pleasing characteristics of the beloved lady. But in Air and Angels, it's reduced down to just a pair of lips and some hair. It's a very short, brief blazon. To suggest to some degree that it's a characterization, it's a gesture or a nod to a poetic tradition of which Donne is very aware, and yet he wants to play with it a little. He wants to turn it into something different. And so the blazon in Air and Angels, which comes at the end of the first verse, I bid love ask, and now that it assume thy body I allow, and fix itself in thy lip, thy eye, thy brow. It's a very brief blazon, and there's nothing particularly personable about these characteristics. It's just a lip, an eye, and a brow. It seems disembodied to some degree, impersonal. There's no way we could build a particular picture of this beautiful woman that he desires. And showing us in part, perhaps that's why the way that love assumes this bodily form and fixes its location of desire upon the body of the woman is so disjointed and impersonal and likely to fail. Of course, the ultimate physical form or body upon which we are to cast our love and fixate our attention is the body of Christ. So there's a symbolism at play here with focusing our love and affection upon a material object. But as we see in Donne's poem, it's destined to fail. Rather than bringing us a union, he talks about union of body and spirit, union of love with a woman or with angels, and the union of man and woman Instead, we have disparity, we have disconnection. So Donne is not just showing us a reworking of Petrarchan poetry with the subtly changed rhyming scheme and with the disembodied, disjointed, very brief blazon. He's also breaking down the possibility of Petrarchan desire itself, our attempts to make that vulgar human love into something divine and pure. So what I note about the final line of Air and Angels is Donne's insistent that despite Petrarchan attempts to reconcile male and female love as it was understood at the time, and despite a generation of poets attempting to make vulgar love somehow sacred, Donne's invocation of angels merely proves his insistence that the struggle is futile. There's a disparity between earthly and holy love. One seeks a body with which to perform its vulgar conclusion, and the other is often too air-like and thin and weightless to be ballast for your ship through life. Angels were believed in early modern times to have no gender, and yet for Donne, gender becomes a stubborn facet of human life that can't easily be ignored. Elsewhere, Donne has composed verse that placed men and women very much in the same predicament. And so my conclusion of Air and Angels is that it's a failure of the Petrarchan project to which he's drawing attention. While Petrarch and his poetic offspring in the 1590s in England sought unity between lover and beloved, and between profane and sacred desire, Donne's short poem of Two Halves demonstrates how divided we remain. In a move that we might now call meta, both Petrarch's poetic style and his poetic ambition are shown to be, so far, unresolved. If this video has been helpful at all, you like this kind of thing, consider subscribing or click like, or do both. I'll be back again with some more explorations into English literature. Thanks for watching.